Well, welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I was going to give our speaker a nice introduction, but the number of, oh, hi, Mike, that I've heard as people walking in, everybody knows Dr. Mike Strezewski, right? Okay. He is a feature here in town, especially in the summer months, leading his team of students on very cool archaeological digs. Tonight he's going to be talking about the Harmonist Tavern. You see the title of his presentation here tonight. So let's all welcome our good friend, Dr. Mike Strezewski, to the Working Men's Institute.
Thank you, and so as Ryan mentioned, I'm here in the summer months most often, May, June, and doing some excavating in various spots around town, but this project here has absolutely nothing to do with digging in the ground, as you'll see momentarily. But I've entitled it An Excellent House of Private Entertainment, the Harmonist Tavern in New Harmony, 1815 to 1825. Now, how did I get involved in this project that had nothing to do with archaeology? Well, the way I got started on it was because I was doing some research related to a book that I finished writing just before the pandemic. It hasn't been published yet, but it's on the Harmonist potter and Harmonist pottery. Harmonist potter, whose name was Christoph Weber, and we did some excavations out by the Lentz House 3 years, and we uncovered a big part of the pottery kiln out there. And then I went out to economy and I looked at the pottery out there and did blah, 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 blah. And so we did a huge study on the Harmonist pottery. And I spent some time looking at the records, the Harmonist records that are here at the WMI to get some information about pottery production. So, how much lead did they use? How much, what was their production numbers? How much was the pottery worth, et cetera, et cetera. And in the process of doing that, I had to look at other records as well. And I noticed that there were quite a few records on the operation of the tavern. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool, that there's like these records on how the tavern was operated and the amount of stuff that was ordered for the tavern and all that. So I just kind of shoved it at the back of my mind for a couple of years and kind of kept it there thinking like, I should do something with that at some point in time. Well, that point in time eventually arrived, and I went back and I got all of the information that I could from the microfilm records of the Harmonist day books, etc., and compiled all that information so we could say something a little bit about the operation of the tavern. So that's where it came from, right? So a little bit about taverns before we get started here. Taverns were kind of an institution on the frontier. They served, as they say here, like a small boarding house in the sense that if the roads being pretty shabby in the early 1800s, people wanting to travel from one spot like New Harmony to another spot like, let's say, Kaskaskia over here in Illinois, you had to travel along these pretty lousy roads. It was probably going to take you a few days to get there. And what were you going to do in the meantime as you're going from one spot to another through, let's say, southern Illinois? Well, you had to stop off somewhere, right? I suppose you could sleep outside, but who wants to do that, right? So what you would do is stop off at a tavern. Now, some of these taverns were formal operations in the sense that it was a business that somebody ran, and most often those are the ones that were in a particular town. One of the first things many of these towns did when they started up was to build a tavern for travelers. But many of these taverns were more this sort of ad hoc type thing where, a person who lived along the road, along the main road, they would take in travelers, knock, 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 hey, I'm traveling here and I want to stop for the night, can you take me in? I'll give you a few cents here to cover the costs. Sure, we got some food, sleep on the floor over there, and that sort of thing, right? So they varied from being, something that was like a proper business, all the way down to just, knocking on somebody's door and asking for a place to stay, right? But as I said, they offered lodging for the night, food, drink, whatever they happen to have on hand, in the case of the more informal tavern operations, right? So, as I said, the accommodations varied greatly. This is a drawing from a book that was published in 1821 showing a log tavern in Indiana, and this would have been something that was more a dedicated tavern rather than someone's house. here's a drawing of a tavern in Wemborough, Illinois. This is the English Prairie settlement, and this is a tavern operated by a man named William Hall, and this is a drawing done by Charles Alexander Lesueur of the tavern, and you can see basically what it amounts to is a double pen log cabin with what you call a log cabin with a breezeway in the center there, and you can see the guests standing out on the porch of the tavern. Here's a nice little drawing that Lesueur did from the porch itself, showing the tables and the food kind of laid out in preparation for serving a meal, right? So it looks rather cozy, right? But they weren't all cozy. Now, one of the things that I found quite funny was the people's descriptions of taverns in and around this area and elsewhere. And I'm inclined to believe that most of those descriptions were generated out of the complaints over the lousy conditions found in those taverns. It was like the Yelp of its day, where someone, if you found a crappy tavern that had poor accommodations, you'd write it in your book that the taverns in this area are just complete garbage. Here's one from William Foe in 1818. He's writing about it, one of the taverns in the English Prairie, and here's what he had to say. I supped and I went to bed in a hog-sty of a room containing 4 filthy beds and 8 mean persons. The sheets stinking and dirty, scarcity of water, I suppose, is the cause. The beds lie on boards, not cords, and are so hard that I could not sleep. 3 in one bed, all filth, no comfort, and yet this is an English tavern. No whiskey, no milk, and vile tea in this land of prairies. There's another one that's like a land of rats crawling on it as he was trying to sleep, right? So you can see what sort of things were to be expected. You're not going to find a hotel like this, or not too many of them, like that today, right? Our expectations are a bit higher. Here's another one from also the English Prairie in 1819. Our own fare, the food that they were served, proved little better than that of our horses, which spoke volumes on the state of the settlement. Some very rancid butter, a little sour bread, and I like this, and some slices of lean fried beef, which it was vain to expect the teeth could penetrate. Washed down by bad coffee, sweetened with wild honey, formed our repast. We asked for eggs, milk, sugar, salt. The answer to all was, we have none, right? So that was a lot of what people were experiencing on the frontier, these sorts of taverns. There was one tavern too where a guy had a bear tied up, and then the bear escaped, and it grabbed a kid and dragged him outside, and an old man came out and beat the bear and dragged the kid back in, and he's like, what the heck kind of tavern is this? So the Harmonist Tavern was actually quite a bit different than most of them that existed at that time period, right? So, the Harmonists, sure most of you know the basic story here, right? But the Harmonists purchased the land in what was the Indiana Territory at that time, with the first persons arriving in June of 1814. And very soon after that, they felt the need for a tavern, right? So George Rapp, writing to his adopted son Frederick Rapp in December of 1814, like 6 months or so after they arrived, he said that strangers often come late at night, and then we have no bed. We must build a double log cabin for this purpose. So he said to him, this is one thing we definitely need in our new town is a tavern. And he asked him, could you please send the beds from the old tavern over here so that we can get that up and running and get that operation going? And that's exactly what Frederick did, because soon after they opened up a tavern here in New Harmony, right? Now this tavern was apparently a luxury accommodations compared to most that I've described, right? It was described as the best tavern that they'd found in Indiana. So William Blaney, passing through town in 1822, said it was an excellent house of private entertainment, which is where I get the title for the talk, right? It's kept by one of their number named Frederick Eckensberger, right? He was the tavern keeper here. Everything here was so clean, comfortable, and well arranged that I was quite delighted, right? Thomas Hold in 1819, a few years previous to that, wrote, having refreshed ourselves at the tavern where we found everything we wanted for ourselves and our horses, all very clean and nice, besides many good things we did not expect, such as beer, porter, and even wine, all made within the society and very good indeed, right? So glowing review, 5 stars from many of the people that came to the Harmonist Tavern. By the way, this is a photo of the tavern and the actual tavern building in 1903. Of course, long after the Harmonists left, but that's the actual building that was standing up until about 100 years ago or so. Okay, so what about the accommodations? What would have been like to stay in the Harmonist Tavern? Here's some accounts of that. So William Foe in 1819, he said he slept in a good, clean bedroom, 4 beds in a room, right? So you didn't get your own private room. 4 beds in a room, 1 in each corner, but he found bad beef, wasn't a fan of the beef, right? But good bread and high charges, $1.05 each. He thought it was a bit overpriced for what you got, but nonetheless, it was well kept, right? And then Adlard Welby in 1819 said, it was neatness itself, but furnished in the very plainest manner, right? Beyond a 3-cornered armchair, there was not a piece of furniture which could excite the repose of indolence or the indulgence of luxury. After a plain repast, accompanied, however, with some good beer and a bottle of white wine, boasts the produce of the colony. He mentions also that some of the things that were being served there were stuff that was being manufactured in New Harmony. Interesting to note that he said that the rooms were very plain. He had some beds in there, a chair. That was basically it. And the notion here being that the Harmonists led a very plain life. They didn't have all these luxurious items inside of their homes, and they felt that that was good enough for visitors who came to the town as well, right? So nothing too fancy. And actually, I have a list of items that were in the tavern when they sold the town. They left the tavern contents for Owen, and I have a list of all the things that were in the tavern. Again, you think usual stuff, dishes, pots and pans, all that kind of stuff, a certain number of chairs and tables and what have you. The only things that were expensive was there was called a banjo clock. There was a clock in there, a wind-up clock, and a set of maps. And those were the only 2 things that were a bit more pricey. But other than that, some plain, ordinary stuff, right? Okay, so here's a map. This is the Pickering Map of the town. It was produced in 1824. Now, if you know anything about this map, you'll know that it was produced by, it was commissioned by Rapp as a means to help sell the town, right? So they wanted to advertise the facilities within the town. And it's a very nice map because Pickering was a surveyor and he knew what he was doing and he made a very good, accurate map, right? So as you can see, the tavern's right here, right? This torn spot right here on the map. And then it's basically situated right at kind of the hub of the town where the Harmonists who would come in contact with the outside world, where all those facilities existed. Rapp was trying to keep people, his followers, separated from those outsiders, except for this, little area here, this kind of commercial center of the town. So not surprising, the tavern is right in that spot right there. There's the store, right, where people would come to buy items of Harmonist manufacture, plus other things that they had purchased, the warehouse. There's the doctor's office where Harmonists and non-Harmonists could get some treatment, right? And then other facilities that persons, travelers might take advantage of, like the blacksmith shop or the wheelwrights or something like that, were also found in this kind of central hub of the town, right? So you can see that square, that open area towards the top there. So it's not surprising that all these things were kind of in one place. If we zoom in a little bit, this is just my redrawing of that portion of the Pickering map to show you what the facilities were, or what he told us they were. You've got the tavern itself. That's the building that showed you in the photo. This is interesting. In this depiction of the tavern, Pickering's depiction of the tavern, he actually shows the interior rooms of the first floor, which he did not show in any of the other buildings. So you don't see that in any of the other buildings here. The reason I think that he did that in this one is because that's where he was staying, right, while he was making the map. So he knew the interior rooms very well, and he drew them in there accordingly, right? So we've got that. That's nice that we know. I think these dots here that are shown on the map, those might be stoves, like for heating and that sort of thing. If they're not identified on the map as to what they are, but that's what I think. And these are probably fireplaces. So we've got the interior rooms here. We don't know what exactly they were used for. Some might have been for sleeping. storage, cooking, lounging around. We're not 100% sure on that. Then there's another building right here. There's a brick structure, a smaller brick structure that's attached to the tavern. This might have been a kitchen and or the residence of Eckensberger, the tavern keeper. It's not identified either way, but it's a 2-story brick structure. There was an exterior porch, a 2-story exterior porch with some stairs to get up to the 2nd floor, and I think it probably led to the 2nd floor of the tavern as well. And then you've got a stable back here, and I think these are representing the stalls for the stable. And then a shed in the back, probably for storage purposes or what have you, and a smokehouse. Lots of meat, as you might imagine, being served at the tavern. And then there's a big garden here, which I believe is most likely for a kitchen garden for the food that was served at the tavern. And then you've got an open yard here. And you can see also that in this area right here is a pump. And there's an entrance to the yard to the tavern just south of that pump, right? So it's nice and convenient. Here's a drawing by Lesueur showing exactly the thing that I just showed you, right? You can see the tavern right in that spot right there. This is most likely the brick structure, and you can kind of see as he's depicting the 2-story porch on the outside right there. And then those other buildings there, we might be looking at the stable, the shed, and the smokehouse. And then behind there, that other building there is almost certainly the school, right? And you can see this open area here. Here's the pump that I just showed you, right? Yeah, so one thing about the tavern to mention here at the top is that travelers mentioned there was a sign out in front of the building that said private entertainment, right? Well, what does that mean? Essentially what they were doing is trying to deter drunkenness. It was essentially like if you were a person, an undesirable person, they had the right to turn you out, right? One of the things that people complained about this tavern was that they didn't allow drunkenness. Oh, I can't get drunk here? Don't. Well, you know, they didn't allow that sort of thing. It wasn't the sort of behavior they wanted inside of their town, and so they kind of limited what people could drink and the amount that they could drink. The Harmonists themselves did not go in the tavern. That wasn't considered a good place for a Harmonist to be, right? Strictly for outsiders. Now here's what happened to the building. In 1908, it burned down, along with some other buildings. There's a big fire in town, right over there. And that's what's left of the tavern, right? Unfortunately. And here's what's there today, right? You know, look familiar. Which is the main reason why I haven't done any archaeology here, because it's rather impossible to do archaeology when there's a big building sitting right on top of where the building of interest used to be. There may be some potential of doing archaeology out back here somewhere where the brick structure was, or the smokehouse, or some of those other things back there, but it gets kind of busy back there with some parking lots and stuff like that. It might be a little bit of a hassle to try to do any kind of archaeological work back there. So I was left with the historic records alone rather than any kind of excavations or artifacts that we might have gotten from those excavations. Right? So, frontier taverns. Right? How are we going to learn about them? Well, we can do archaeology, and there have been archaeological excavations at frontier taverns. There's been a couple in Illinois, not really in Indiana, but some out east. Some of the colonial era taverns have been excavated. So there's been a few excavations, and as I said, it's not really possible to do that sort of thing in New Harmony. At least I haven't, like I said, haven't tried it yet to see if there's anything remaining. You know, in a town like this that's been occupied for the past 200 years, things get built, torn down, bulldozer comes in, moves this, there, and that, and then, you know, village gets thrown on top of it, and things get all mixed up. That's just the way towns work so you don't know if there's anything remaining underneath the ground until you look. So, haven't looked yet, right? So, no archaeological information. The other way that we can look at taverns is through historical records, and I showed you a little bit about some of those travelers' accounts and people complaining about the tavern, etc., and the lousy accommodations there. But in general, there's a real lack of primary documents about taverns. That is, you know, documents that talk about, you know, who stayed there, how much they spent, what they served there, all these sorts of things that we would need to help reconstruct what the business was like, really. You know, there's a few things in Indiana. There's like something from one tavern for a year here. There's a partial day book or something like that from another tavern, but there's no kind of a big, expansive set of records for any tavern in Indiana or, outside the area, really, for that matter, that would allow us to really, really say something in detail about how that operation worked, right? So that's why the New Harmony information, even though it's not a typical tavern, right? It's owned by the Harmonists. It's not owned by just some regular Posey County person, right? It's atypical in that regard, and it's also atypical in the fact that it's really nice, right? Regardless, that's all we've got, as far as records are concerned. So this is a typical page from the records, the Harmonist Records regarding the tavern. Now, the nice thing about the Harmonists, from my perspective at least, is they kept the best records during the New Harmony decade. The ones at their first town in Pennsylvania are okay. They pick up a little bit as they got organized. Then in New Harmony, they really buckled down and they wrote everything down, every last little tiny detail. And then after they moved to economy, they slacked off and they stopped writing things down again. So this is the best decade, the best documented decade in Harmonist history, the 100 years of the whole enterprise. So I was, pretty excited that we had lots of good detailed information about the operation of the tavern. So typically what you're looking at here for these pages, there's no information about who stayed at the tavern, how long, what they bought. We don't have that. What we do have is a list of things purchased and the amount of cash taken in. It was simply a plus minus sort of column, and then they could subtract one from the other and figure out how much they made, right? So you look on this column over here, you've got the amount brought forward, $117.14.5, right? And on October 9th, I forget what year this is, but on October 9th, they bought 3 pounds of butter and 6 dozen eggs for 70 cents, right? On November 4th, they bought 2 fish for $1 and 1 gallon of peach brandy. You know what? I got pretty good at reading this stuff. It was $2.25, right? I was on vacation in Greece, actually. My wife is from Greece, some of you probably know that, but my wife is from Greece, and when I'm in Greece, sometimes I'm with my in-laws, that kind of thing, and visiting your in-laws in Greece isn't a whole lot different from visiting your in-laws in Peoria, so I found myself with a little bit of free time, right? And I said, well, what the hell? I'm going to spend this productively, right? So I sat down with all these images that I had taken of the microfilm, and I transcribed the whole thing. It took a long time, right? But when it got spit out at the end, I had some real good information. All right, so I made a database of all of that information, the dates, the amounts, the units, the item, whether it's allspice or butter, sugar, bacon, etc., how much it costs, and a few notes there about each entry, right? So the last entry for Harmony, Pennsylvania was in February of 1815. That's when they closed it down, shipped the beds over to New Harmony. So the New Harmony Tavern, the records begin in June of 1815, and they end in April of 1825, right? So I had 1,061 entries there over that time period of things that were purchased for the tavern. And then they shut it down in April of 1825. It was handed over to Owen, where it became the Yellow Tavern, and Owen lived there, and a bunch of people on the boatload of knowledge stayed there, etc. It was used as a tavern for some time by the Owen community, and then the Harmonist operation moves over to Economy, Pennsylvania in June of 1825. So they got right back to business, just a bit of a month or so lull in the tavern operation before they got started over in Pennsylvania. Right. But as I said, the records sort of drop off after they get to economy, especially after the 1830s or so. It gets really spotty. So start crunching the numbers, and we can start saying some stuff about what this tavern was all about. First of all, you can see the business was steady throughout the year. So here's January through December, and these are data from 1815 to 1823. How much money did they bring in, right? What was the net? And you can see during the summer months it maybe picked up a little bit, but overall there were people staying at the tavern utilizing and purchasing things at the tavern all throughout the entire year, right? So that's one thing. All right, some of the things that were being served at the tavern, right? Got lots of information on stuff that was purchased for the tavern. Beer, right? Here's a nice little ad from Vincennes newspaper in May of 1819. F-Rap, Frederick Rapp, will always have on hand and for sale the first quality of strong beer by the barrel at Harmony, Indiana, right? So beer was first purchased for the tavern in 1819, and they bought about 457 gallons a year, an average of 457 gallons of beer a year. Beer was not a big thing in the United States, mostly until after the Civil War. It requires relatively cool temperatures, storage, that kind of thing. That really, there was a German tradition of making beer, and those folks, a lot of them arrived after the Civil War. So beer wasn't a big thing that was drunk a lot in the United States at this time. Nonetheless, they sold a lot of beer here. So how much did they pay for it? 16 gallons was $5. And that was the wholesale price that they were charging themselves, right? If they were going to sell beer to somebody else, they'd charge a little bit more. Yeah, the reason that beer was first offered in 1819 is that's when they first got the brewery going, right? So, adding up some numbers, I did take a look a little bit at some of the numbers for the brewery operation and the distilleries and that sort of thing. I didn't kind of systematically go through all the information and compile it yet. But the tavern took up about 20% of the town's or the society's beer production over any given year, right? And the brewery was located off of North Street over towards like the Red Geranium in that area, right? And that's from the Pickering Map. You can see brewery right there. They had the distillery over there as well. Another big customer for Harmonist beer was the English Prairie folks, right? Now these were people who were immigrants from England, hence the name English Prairie, right? And being from England, they had a tradition of beer consumption. And the tavern keepers there at English Prairie were telling the Harmonists, basically keep the beer flowing because we have a lot of call for it here in town. And I just dug a cellar in my tavern, and I'm going to have a way to keep it cool, so keep it going, right? So I was able to link up certain names with the English Prairie, such and such amount of beer sold to this individual. Who the heck's that? Well, a lot of these people were English Prairie folks. At least 47% of the beer produced in New Harmony was shipped off to the English Prairie for sale. Right? Now, wine. One of the reasons that Rapp was wanting to move from Pennsylvania to Indiana was he wanted to start up wine production. Right? That was one of his trades when he was back in Germany. He was a vine dresser and all that sort of thing, so he had some expertise in wine production. He wanted to make wine here in Indiana. He received various reports on whether or not people would be keen to purchase wine around here. I saw one letter saying like, oh yeah, start it up, people are going to be interested. Another one like saying, forget it, people don't want wine around here, So there was kind of differing reports on what the reception would be to wine production. But it wasn't really a very popular thing in the United States. It's getting more so nowadays, but not in the 19th century. But the wine that was made in this, or that was sold in this area at this time was often served as fortified wine. Essentially what they do is they'd add distilled spirits to it, so jack up the alcohol content in the wine. So, yeah, there you go. Mad Dog or whatever, right? The good stuff, right? For the tavern, some of it is known to be Harmonist wine. Like I showed you those accounts where people said, we were served wine of Harmonist production and that kind of thing. Sometimes in the tallies, in the tavern accounts, they'll say Harmonist wine, and it'll give a price for that. There's a certain period of time when they do specify Harmonist wine, and then oftentimes it just says wine, so I can't 100% be sure if it was Harmonist or not. So a little bit unclear there. It's just a matter of what they chose to write down or not, right? Those Harmonists are the just kind of ordinary wine, was usually about $2.50 a gallon. The imported wines, there's a Tenerife and Lisbon wines. Those were more expensive. They didn't sell a heck of a lot of those here. It was more popular over in Pennsylvania, and then it dropped off to basically nothing once they came here. There are reports that the people around here were rather poor and couldn't afford expensive alcohol, and so some of the cheaper stuff sold big, whereas imported wines and that sort of thing, not so much, right? So overall, the sales in New Harmony of wine were pretty modest, only about 16 gallons a year. To kind of compare that to the beer, there was only about 3.5% of the beer sales, so a lot more beer than they did sell wine. The reception or the opinions on the Harmonist wine varied greatly. Some said it tasted fine. Other folks said it wasn't that great at all. It was insipid garbage. So, take your pick. I'm not sure, how it tasted, but there were varying opinions, let's just say, right? Okay, other things that were served in the tavern. Cider. Now, today, we think of cider as just, pressed apples without alcohol content. When they said cider back then, they meant hard cider, that is fermented apple juice with an alcohol content. Now, this was a pretty popular drink in like the early 19th century. The reason being that there was a glut of apples, right? Why the heck we have so many apples? You've got farmers starting farms all around this area. Apples are heavy. They're prone to spoilage. They somewhat fragile. They can get beat up. And your roads stink, right? What are you going to do with all these apples, right? I just planted all these apple trees. They're starting to produce apples now, and I have nothing to do with them. What am I going to do? I'm going to take them, I'm going to crush them down into apple juice, and I'm going to make cider out of them instead, right? That's much more, it's saleable alcohol, right? People are going to want to buy that, and it's easier to transport and all that sort of thing as well, right? So hard cider had about 10% alcohol, which also was sometimes fortified with distilled spirits to jack up the alcohol content. Also helped to prevent spoilage, right? But that was referred to as cider royal. There was a little bit of that served at the tavern. But the tavern didn't purchase a heck of a lot of cider. It was only purchased in about 4 out of the 10 years, right? So that wasn't a big seller. It was also, another thing too, is that cider was considered a patriotic beverage because it was produced here. All this kind of fervor for the early republic. People are now an independent country. We're going to make our own stuff. We don't have to rely on the British anymore. So something that was produced here in the United States was considered to be, something that people should be drinking as opposed to things that were imported from, elsewhere outside of the U.S., right? All right, so the big seller then, or a big seller at the tavern here was whiskey, right? This was the biggest selling distilled spirit in the early republic. Before the Revolutionary War, the biggest seller was rum. And essentially what happened was, rum was something that was produced from molasses, which was produced from sugarcane, which was grown in the West Indies. So that had to be imported into the East Coast, where these rum-producing companies were making rum, and that was the favored beverage, hard alcohol, that is at least, in pre-Revolutionary War era. After the Revolutionary War, you've got another glut of corn, right? People growing corn. What are you going to do with it all? Let's turn it into whiskey, right? And so the whiskey that was being made, this is not fine aged spirits here, right? Probably like burned all the way down and destroyed your esophagus, I imagine. But it was about 45% alcohol or so, depending on how many times you ran it through the distillery. You could pump up the alcohol volume on it. But this was a big seller in the early republic. As I said, it was also considered a patriotic beverage because it was made of locally grown corn, right, as opposed to rum, which was something that was a British-made product, or product of the West Indies. The Harmonist distilleries, there were 2 of them. There was one, as I said, over in the north side of town, over by like near the Red Geranium over there. There was another one over on the southwest side of town, which is basically like on the very edge of town. There was another distillery there, right? think someday it might be interesting to see if you can find the distillery archaeologically, but that's for another field season. But just to kind of give you an idea of the volume of whiskey that was being made in the interior U.S. and shipped out, here, I got some numbers here. In New Orleans in 1812, a couple of years before the Harmonists arrived, they received 11,000 gallons of whiskey. By 1825, the year that they left, it was 570,000 gallons. From 11,000 to 570,000 gallons of whiskey. That's a lot of whiskey that's being made. And the price of whiskey, of course, went down over the years as a result. But that was the main hard alcohol that was being sold at the tavern. There were minor amounts of other things like brandy, gin, and rum, a gallon here, a gallon there. Also something called Persico, which was a peach-flavored German liqueur that was being sold at the tavern. But here's what happened to whiskey prices over time. When the Harmonists first arrived, they didn't have any production. They had to buy it off, they had to buy it from elsewhere to sell in the tavern. But the price was hovering around $1 per gallon. And as you see, through 1821 or so, the price goes down, 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 and you're looking at about less than 40 cents per gallon price there. And it had, I'm sure, a lot to do with the fact that there was just so much whiskey flowing all over the place that it was outstripping the demand. So that's what happened with the whiskey prices. Now, compiling all of these numbers, I came across a very strange sort of pattern here, or something that really demanded some type of explanation. What I could see with whiskey was this. Early years of the tavern, 1815, 16, 17, very modest sales of whiskey. Then as you get into 18, 18, and 19, it goes through the roof. And then drops off to nothing after that. Zero after that. And I thought, well, what the heck is going on here? Obviously, this is a big money maker. People are flocking to the tavern to get whiskey, and all of a sudden, like the spigot was shut off, and there's no more whiskey being offered at the tavern. They're not ordering anymore. They're not purchasing it or anything. What is going on here? And I racked my brain for some time as to what happened at about this time that they might have changed their policies or stopped selling or buying or stopped selling whiskey at the tavern. And I came across, pouring through Arndt and everything like that, looking at what was happening at about this time. Here's what happened at about that time. There was a riot in New Harmony, right? This is a representation of the riot here. A riot in New Harmony. So what happened in January of 1820, a local non-Harmonist person by the name of William Harris assaulted two Harmonists. Apparently there was some type of a dispute over a couple people that were indentured to the Harmonists. And Frederick Eckensberger is named as a person who was drawn into the fight. The tavern keeper was drawn into the fight. I don't know where the fight occurred, if it was at the tavern. It's possible since he was part of this fight. But that was the first day. There was a fight. Eckensberger was drawn into it. Then the next day, 9 men show up outside of town with clubs, sticks, rifles, guns, and other offensive weapons and assault 6 Harmonists. And then later in that day, 12 men came into town and basically there was a riot in town for about 2 hours. They went to Eckensberger's home and they threatened him, right? So this Eckensberger was like one of the people that was directly involved in this whole thing. Now, the Harmonists, of course, weren't terribly happy about this sort of thing, violence in their town. They brought a court case to Posey County courts. They were going to prosecute the people that came into town and started the riot. And what happened was it just basically got dropped, essentially. A couple of the people that were involved in the riot were found guilty, had to pay a small fine. The main guy, Harris, there, he didn't show up to court, and the charges were dropped, and that was the end of it. It never came to anything. The Harmonists felt, hey, the courts aren't listening to us. We have no redress for a riot that occurred in our town, right? And so the Harmonist response to that was basically one of resignation. There you go. Right? What the heck's going on here? Why aren't we being supported by the courts? Why are we being treated this way? And here's a couple of bits of information or bits of letters that date to that exact time period talking about the results of that court case. Here's a letter from Remilius Baker to John Baker, two Harmonists, in October 1820, after this was decided. He said, there's no other way for us than to have as little to do with the world as possible, right? We can't associate it with these people, and we should isolate ourselves from them as much as possible. Here's another one. This is Frederick Rapp to John Baker in October of 1820. We are determined more and more to limit ourselves to ourselves. The world can no longer bear us, and we cannot bear it until it is judged, right? We were ripped off. We were treated poorly in the courts. We're not going to associate with these folks anymore. This is ridiculous, right? And so I think, based upon all these little bits and pieces of data, I think that what happened here was the solution to that problem, the solution to possible violence in the town, drunkenness and all that sort of thing in the town, was to cut off hard liquor sales. You could sell beer, you could sell wine, you could sell cider. All those things continued unabated at the same levels they were before, but hard alcohol dropped off to nothing, right? So what happened was, I showed in the previous slide, I showed that there was some alcohol or some whiskey that was purchased in 1820. That was only purchased at the very beginning of the year. January 7th, 2 weeks before the riot, they bought 33.5 gallons of whiskey. It's a whole barrel full, right? And then the next time they bought whiskey was a month after. So apparently they didn't make that decision right away. But a month after the riot, they bought another 32 gallons, and then that was it, right? Between March 21st, or March of 1821 and April of 1825, they bought 3 gallons total for those, 4 years. When they were buying barrel after barrel after barrel of whiskey that whole time, they bought 3 gallons total for 4 years. So you get a little tiny sip apparently, but that was about it, right? You're not going to get hard alcohol at the Harmonist Tavern, right? So it wasn't a matter of the Harmonists stopping whiskey production. Those two distilleries were operating continuously throughout that time. They didn't decide, we're not going to have anything to do with whiskey or hard alcohol production. They just didn't want anybody drinking it here, right? So they were selling all this whiskey to their neighbors here and there, all over the place, but you just could not drink it in town. This is a letter to Frederick Rapp's response to a letter of a person inquiring about purchasing some whiskey. And he said, an uncommon call for whiskey during harvest by our neighbors. Apparently during the harvest period, everybody wanted to drink whiskey, right? Whom we could not refuse without offense, right? So either our neighbors, we have to accommodate them, we have to sell the whiskey to them, so that all the new whiskeys are now sold to the barrel, right? We don't have any available because we've sold it all to our neighbors, right? Not a problem. So as kind of further evidence of this pattern, what you can see is once they moved over to economy in the latter half of 1825 and then 1826, the whiskey sales come back again, full whiskey sales, like nothing ever happened, right? In 1825, they sold 73.5 gallons. 1826, it was up to 180 gallons that first full year in Pennsylvania. Cut off in Indiana. Once you get back to Pennsylvania, back up again, selling whiskey. So no problem selling it over there, right? So what happened then is that's going to affect your bottom line, of course. People are going to get to the point where they want whiskey, but you're not selling it. Why am I going to go to your tavern? There's another tavern over here that's selling whiskey, and I don't have to watch my drunkenness or whatever the heck, the sort of limitations they were putting on people. So you can see here's the net profit of the tavern. This is the New Harmony portion of 1815. You can see it goes up through 1819, and then down through 1823. I don't have numbers for 1824 and 1825 for the nets there. Those numbers were missing. But you can see that the profits of the tavern continued to diminish after that point at which they decided they were no longer going to sell whiskey in town here. So that's all I have to say, and I'll answer any questions you might have if I know the answer to them, right? So, yes, Linda.
When you were talking about the Harmonist leaving and then the Owen period in the tavern,
Yeah.
You said Owen lived in the tavern. How do you know that?
I saw some report that he was living there. I don't recall where I saw it, but
I wasn't for sure about that. I wasn't for sure about that either.
Yeah,
Because I've always wondered where was he living, because we knew McClure was in the McClure house, but we don't know exactly where Owen was living.
Man, you know, if I come across it, I know where I find where I saw that, I'd let you know. But it's been a little while since I looked at those sources, so I don't remember now off the top of my head.
Another thing I noticed was the ad in the Vincennes paper in 1819 talks about Harmony, Indiana, and we always have this big discussion about New Harmony, and we keep telling people it wasn't New Harmony then, it was still Harmony.
Yeah. I guess there's some references here and there where they did call it New Harmony, but for the most part they called it Harmony. Yeah, true. And
With an IE.
that proves it with an IE, as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it was the IE, and they wrote. I guess it was Pitzer that wrote. They talked about their New Harmony, but they meant it being it's a new town, not the name.
The new version of Harmony.
NE.
Yes.
Interesting.
Any other questions anybody has?
Are you going to write a paper about this?
Oh yeah, just good thing you asked. I did already. It's going to be in an edited volume that Bill Elliott in geology and a couple other people are editing a volume on New Harmony, various aspects of the town. You know, Bill Elliott's going to deal with geology issues, and I got my little neck of the woods here. And they're looking at, I think it's University of Illinois Press. And my chapter's done, but I think most of the other chapters are not done yet. Because I was already writing it when they proposed the volume. I said, I've got this thing already in hand, and I gave it to them to use as a sample chapter. But it's probably a couple of years off. But it will see the light of day at some point in time. But it's basically just everything I talked about here in a little bit more detail. So. Anything else?
Well, if there's no other questions for Mike, I want to say thank you for being here tonight. That was an extremely informative, very entertaining lecture as well. And thank you all so much for coming out. A small, intimate group tonight, but stay for a few minutes, mingle, enjoy some cookies, enjoy some water, enjoy your evening, and thank you once again for being here at the Working Men's Institute.
No whiskey.
No whiskey.
I didn't bring any, no. Samples.
It's all